In this session, we will walk through the features of the LCME Part 1A Annual Financial Questionnaire, or AFQ for short. This walkthrough is meant for both those who are new to the AFQ and those who would like a comprehensive refresher on the AFQ. Before we get started, here are some abbreviations and terms that we often use when we talk about the LCME Part 1A. AFQ. This is the abbreviation for the LCME Part 1A Annual Financial Questionnaire. Although the AFQ workbook is the main portion of the survey, a complete LCME Part 1A submission will also include the overview survey and the signature page. We will cover these other portions later in the presentation. LCME stands for the Liaison Committee on Medical Education. The LCME is an independent group that provides accreditation for MD granting medical education programs in the US and Canada, like your own. MSPS stands for Medical School Profile System. MSPS is a web application that allows you to query institution-level data and is also a portal where you can download important reports and surveys specific to your medical school, just like the AFQ. PBO stands for Principal Business Officer. The designation Principal Business Officer was created by the AAMC to refer to a person who can be the AAMC's point of contact for various financial, operational, and data issues. The PBO has access to the LCME Part 1A by default. Other individuals who are working on the AFQ or who want access to data based on the AFQ must get approval from the PBO. So, where do you find the AFQ and overview survey? You can't complete the AFQ without downloading it first. So where do you find it? You find these materials on the Medical School Profile System, or MSPS for short. This is the initial login page for MSPS. Click the login button to log in to MSPS. This is the main sign-in page for the AAMC's web services. Enter your AAMC username and password here. If you don't have an account, click Create Account. If you're creating an account for the first time, be sure to send an email to afq@aamc.org and include your PBO so that the PBO can approve your access. This is the landing page of MSPS. Notice the light blue tabs at the top of the screen. The AFQ is located in the LCME 1A tab. If you don't see the LCME 1A tab, email afq@aamc.org to let us know. Your PBO may need to prove your access before we can activate this tab. This is the tab for the LCME Part 1A survey. As you can see, it appears as though I'm logged in as a medical school. When you log in, you should see your medical school's name on this page. Within the LCME 1A tab, you will find survey materials for you to use and reference. Your medical school's AFQ Excel workbook, AFQ password PDF document, and link to your medical school's overview survey are listed here. Also, reference copies of the AFQ and overview survey are listed here for your review alongside a PDF document containing a link to this training video. So now that you know where to find the AFQ, let's open a demonstration copy and walk through the workbook.
AFQ workbooks are password protected to address data confidentiality concerns. Your AFQ password is unique to your medical school and will need to be entered each time the AFQ workbook is opened. Here is how your school-specific PDF document that contains your medical school's AFQ password will look. The highlighted section here is the password you will use to open your AFQ. Please note that the highlighted section may contain an additional space at the end. That space is not part of the password. If you copy the password with the additional space and enter it into the encrypted workbook, it will not work. Here, you can see that there is no additional space highlighted at the end of the password. We will copy and paste this password to open the workbook. Now that the workbook is opened, this is what you should see when first opening the AFQ. This image may look familiar to you. It is the cover page of the AFQ. We will walk through the entire workbook in just a few minutes, but before we do, I would like to review the AAMC's data release policy concerning the data collected in the AFQ. You can review this data release policy in the Data Release Policy section of the Introduction worksheet of the AFQ workbook. Some data collected in the AFQ are classified as unrestricted and others are classified as confidential. Confidential items are not released to anyone other than the LCME on a school-identified basis. For example, revenues and expenditures related to your practice plan are classified as confidential. Since these practice plan dollars are figured in the bottom line, your medical school's total revenues and total expenditures are also considered confidential. All other items are classified as unrestricted, meaning they can be released on a school-identified basis. That said, it is important to note that while these data elements can be released, we do not necessarily have to release them. Our priority is to carefully evaluate all data requests to ensure that your data will not be used in a way that is harmful to your medical school. We take the privacy of your data very seriously here at the AAMC. We do not view the data collected in this survey as being our own data, but rather we view the data as being yours and for which we are the stewards. Table of Contents. Here is the table of contents of the AFQ workbook. You can use the links in the table of contents to navigate the workbook. As you can see, the AFQ contains 3 sections of worksheets: information worksheets, data entry worksheets, and data review worksheets. The information worksheets include the introduction worksheet, the terms and instructions worksheet, and the frequently asked questions worksheet. The data entry worksheets include the signature page, the revenues expenditures data entry worksheet, and the scratch pad. The data review worksheets include schedules A through E and the 5-year history worksheet. In the AFQ workbook, you have access to most Excel controls, such as print settings, screen resolution, zoom in and out options. In addition to the table of content links, you can also use the worksheet tabs seen at the bottom of the screen to navigate the AFQ workbook, and you can click on the worksheet navigation arrows at the bottom left of the window. Now, we will walk through each worksheet of this AFQ workbook. Introduction. The AFQ deadline is usually mid-December. If necessary, the PBO can request an extension to submit the AFQ by emailing us at afq@aamc.org. In this email request, be sure to state the reason for the extension and the specific date by which we can expect to receive your submitted AFQ, overview survey, and signature page. You should send questions and the completed AFQ to us at afq@aamc.org. Both Diana and I monitor and respond to emails received here. Password. As mentioned earlier in this demonstration, AFQ workbooks are password protected to address data confidentiality concerns. Your AFQ password is unique to your medical school and will need to be entered each time the workbook is opened. Data entry alerts. The AFQ workbook uses conditional formatting and custom alert messages that prompt you to address and explain invalid data entries, such as entering negative numbers. For select data, when an invalid data entry alert appears, you must provide an explanation within the respective text box to resolve the flag. The explanations provided are part of your AFQ data. Here's an example of how you can use a link to navigate the workbook. We can click on the Table of Contents link to return to the Table of Contents worksheet. Terms and Instructions. The Terms and Instructions worksheet is a reference guide to the AFQ. The items seen here are definitions to key terms that appear throughout the AFQ. I encourage you to read this section at least once before you start entering data. It will It will help you organize your data before you begin completing the revenues expenditures data entry sheet, and this is an essential reference, so plan to refer to it often. Frequently asked questions. The frequently asked questions worksheet is a must-read for everyone, but especially for people new to the AFQ. These questions tend to come up year after year and address a variety of popular concerns. This section may be helpful to you because the items are based on questions we have received from those who have participated in the AFQ over many years. So, when you are completing the AFQ and questions arise, there is a good chance that this frequently asked questions sheet will be helpful. Signature page. The signature page worksheet serves two purposes. One, it tells us who to contact if we have questions, and two, it also serves as a signature page indicating that your PBO and Dean have reviewed the AFQ contents before submitting. We ask that you designate only one individual as the primary preparer. You may list as many individuals as needed in the other preparers line. After you complete the data entry portion of the AFQ, print or separately save this signature page and have both the PBO and Dean sign the signature page. Please note that electronic signatures using DocuSign, Adobe, or any other signature capturing software are enough for completing the signature page. This signed signature page will then be submitted as an email PDF attachment along with your AFQ workbook submission. As mentioned earlier, the PBO is designated by the medical school's dean as the AAMC's principal contact for medical school finances and administration. Note that the required entries are denoted with red exclamation marks. These exclamation marks are no longer visible when information is typed into the form. Even though signatures are required, they should not be typed in. Therefore, these lines of the form do not include red exclamation marks. Scratchpad. Before diving into the revenues and expenditure sheet, I would like to first highlight the Scratchpad. Feel free to use this sheet however you wish. This is where you can make notes and do calculations or reconciliations. Use this sheet to copy and paste data from internal reports in preparation of populating the data entry sheet. Doing so can help you avoid rekeying data. Now we are ready to dive into the revenues and expenditures sheet. Data entry sheet. The revenues and expenditures sheet is where you enter data. It is the heart of the survey. The AAMC's reports and what is available in the MSPS is based on the information entered here. As a quick aside, I want to direct your attention to this question mark. It is the first of many places throughout the revenues expenditures data entry worksheet that you will see such a question mark. These question marks are hyperlinks leading you to the relevant section of the terms and instructions page. For example, we see a question mark located next to the recorded and not recorded columns. When we click on the question mark next to the recorded column, we are linked to this section of the terms and instructions that defines recorded and not recorded revenues and expenditures and provides examples of such. You can see that tuition and fees collected by the medical school and recorded in medical school accounts is an example of recorded dollars. You can see that salaries paid directly to faculty by affiliated hospitals or by a separately organized practice plan is an example of not recorded dollars. These dollars are not recorded in the financial books of the medical school per se, but rather these dollars are recorded in the financial books of a different institution that is affiliated with the medical school. We will now click on the light purple colored revenues expenditures worksheet to return to the data entry sheet. Data entry only takes place inside the light blue, light orange-ish brown, and light green cells. Note that when invalid data are entered into these data entry cells, the data entry cell is formatted red. The red cells are data entry cells that need a valid data entry. Before submitting the AFQ, none of the data entry cells should be red. When I click on a non-data entry cell, I get an error message. because non-data entry cells cannot be edited in the AFQ workbook. The AFQ workbook only accepts positive numbers in these data entry cells. If you try to enter text, a data validation error notification will appear telling you to only enter a positive numerical value. For example, when we enter a negative number, a data validation error appears. The data entry sheet is designed so that you have no need to enter negative numbers. The revenues expenditures data entry sheet is organized into different sections, delineated by section headings and colors. Some section headings and colors are outlined in blue, whereas others are outlined in brown. The colors of the sections distinguish between restricted funds and unrestricted funds. Blue denotes unrestricted funds. Brown denotes restricted funds. For restricted funds, we only ask for expenditures. Revenues for restricted funds are reported only to the extent they are spent during the fiscal year. Revenues are assumed from the expenditures that you report. For example, if the NIH awards your school $1 million, but you only spend $500,000 of that $1 million during the fiscal year, you report $500,000 in the grants and contracts section. That is, the revenue only to the extent that it was spent during the fiscal year. Thus, when you report expenditures for restricted funds, expenditures equals revenues. By contrast, the AFQ prompts you to report both revenues and expenditures for unrestricted funds. In other words, when you report unrestricted funds, expenditures are not expected to equal revenues. Another cell type you should be aware of are light green colored cells starting at line 57. These light green colored cells are optional. Lastly, there are gray colored cells. These gray colored cells are protected cells. When trying to edit these cells, an error message will appear. For example, cells in column K are gray. These values are automatically calculated in the Revenues Expenditures worksheet. When no data entry is needed, there is no data entry cell visible. For example, for line 72, there is no need to enter anything in the recorded column for the medical school share of central support costs because, by definition, those dollars are expended by the parent and therefore go into the not recorded column where there is a light orange-ish brown data entry cell. There are other features in the AFQ that are worth noting. For each line item of the AFQ, the letters C and U are used to refer to the data classification for each line item. The U's denote unrestricted data and the C's denote confidential data. For example, the U in line 72 denotes that anything entered in line 72 is considered unrestricted information. As you may have noticed, the line numbers in column G are the same as the Excel row numbers. The line number in column G can be useful when working with a printed copy of the data entry sheet. Data entry alerts. We will now scroll to the bottom of the data entry sheet. To demonstrate how a data validation flag works, we will enter a value into line 261. Note how a red-colored message pops up in the right-hand margin asking us to provide an explanation in the red-filled text box in line 268. After we enter an explanation in the text box in line 268, the red flag message disappears and the text box is no longer red-filled. This is one example of a data entry flag on the AFQ. Let's key in Control plus Home to return to the top of the sheet. Now the scratch pad. I would like to take a moment to demonstrate how the scratch pad worksheet can be useful in a hypothetical situation. Suppose a parent institution keeps all tuition and fees collected from medical students. For example, let's say $500,000 of tuition revenues should be entered in the not recorded column. I can link to revenues I already entered on my scratchpad by entering the equal sign in line 18 in the Revenues Expenditures sheet. Then we will click on the scratchpad worksheet. Highlight medical student tuition revenues that have already been entered here and hit the Enter key. Now I see that the tuition revenues from my internal accounting report transfer to the Revenues Expenditures worksheet. In my imaginary scenario, suppose there are no graduate programs, so there is nothing to enter on line 19 in the data entry sheet. But suppose the medical school collected CME revenues recorded on the books of the medical school. This should be entered into the recorded column of line 20. So, we want to transfer the CME revenues from the scratchpad to the Revenues Expenditures worksheet, but instead of using a link, we use the Copy and Paste as Values function to transfer the CME revenues from our scratchpad to our data entry sheet. First, we click on the scratchpad worksheet. We see two accounts with CME revenue. We only want to enter the total CME revenues, so we click on the cell containing total revenues for CME. Click on the copy icon or hit the Control and C keys simultaneously. We know the cell is actively copied when we see that cell highlighted in a green dashed border. Return to the Revenues Expenditures worksheet and, instead of clicking on the paste icon, we click on the little arrow below the paste icon, which pulls up a list of paste options. From that list, we click on the Paste as Values icon. It is important to note here that anything pasted into the Revenues Expenditures worksheet should be pasted as values, so formula references from another workbook or worksheet do not carry over into the AFQ and therefore corrupt the AFQ's data entry worksheet. Because tuition and fees is an unrestricted revenue category, we need to enter expenditures. Expenditures for tuition retained by the parent are automatically entered for us. Note the $500,000 in line 25. You can think of this cell as money that your medical school generated but did not directly receive because it went to the parent. So it is, in a sense, a type of expenditure paid to your parent. It is essentially money that your medical school did not directly receive. Now we will enter the last piece of information from our scratchpad in line 25, CME expenditures, by creating a link to the scratchpad. Enter an equal sign in the recorded cell of line 25. Then highlight the CME expenditure cell in the scratchpad and hit the Enter key. As you can see, we completed the first section of the Revenues Expenditures worksheet without rekeying any numbers. By not manually entering data, we reduce the risk of keying in typos. So far in our example, we have entered $600,000 in tuition revenues and $560,000 in expenditures. Let's check the totals at the bottom of the sheet. We can hit the Control plus End shortcut keys to quickly scroll to the bottom of the data entry sheet to see how the bottom line looks. The totals show $100,000 of revenues and $60,000 of expenditures. But why? I had $600,000 revenues and $560,000 in expenditures up top. This may seem odd, but the reason they do not match is because revenues generated by the medical school were retained by the parent. These revenues are treated as an adjustment to state parent support, and this adjustment is reflected in line 77. As we can see in line 77, $500,000 is tuition revenues. Tuition and fees retained by the parent is automatically entered in the not recorded column of line 77 as an adjustment to state and parent appropriations. If you recall, this is the amount that we entered in the tuition and fees section above in this worksheet. Line 77 shows the money that the parent is receiving, which are the tuition revenues that the medical school generated. The piece of information that this line can capture is that the full amount may not necessarily go back to the medical school. So, this marks the end of the data entry sheet demonstration. We will now return to the table of contents of the AFQ workbook. Schedules. Moving on to the schedules in the AFQ workbook. Everything entered in the data entry sheet automatically populates the schedule sheets. Schedules are reports we have set up for your use. You can view the schedules by clicking on the worksheets at the bottom of the workbook or by clicking on the links of the table of contents. Click on the Schedule A summary worksheet to see how the data entered into the Revenues Expenditures worksheet is reflected in the summary report. We will click on the worksheet to look at Schedule A. Notice how tuition revenues and expenditures and the adjustment to state and parent support are reflected on this schedule. When we click on cell E15, we see the data comes from cell I18 on the data entry sheet. Each schedule is designed to fit on one page. Use Print Preview to see the whole report by going to File, then Print. As you complete the Revenues Expenditures worksheet, you will see that specific schedules like grants, practice plan, hospitals, and government and parent support become populated with data. Data are also reflected in the 5-year history worksheet. Data we entered in the Revenues Expenditures worksheet is reflected in the column labeled Fiscal Year 2024. If this is the first year your school has completed the AFQ, you will not have anything in the prior year columns. A year from now, you will see 2 years of data. And if your school is not a new school, the 5-year history worksheet will display data from previous years, reflecting the data that we have on file for the past 5 years for your medical school. The 5-year history worksheet can be helpful to spot mistakes and compare data with prior years. If you would like to correct or update a prior year's AFQ, you can. Just email the updated prior year's AFQ file to us at afq@aamc.org. Please copy your PBO on that email. We will help you update your AFQ data. We encourage you to look at your 5-year history worksheets after you are done filling in the data because the LCME uses the 5-year history worksheet when they come to your school for site visits. So this concludes our walkthrough of the AFQ workbook. We hope that you feel a bit more familiar with the AFQ workbook and how to navigate it using either the table of contents or Excel commands. In this demonstration, we have reviewed where to enter data on the Revenues Expenditures worksheet and how to use hyperlinks to review terms and instructions. We covered concepts such as the difference between recorded and not recorded revenues, the difference between restricted and unrestricted revenues, and how state and parent revenues are adjusted for money generated by the medical school but retained by the parent. We demonstrated how to use the Scratchpad to populate your Revenues Expenditures worksheet and why it is important to use paste as values. We demonstrated how data from the data entry sheet are reflected in the schedules and the 5-year history report contained within your workbook. And lastly, we shared where to send your completed AFQ and signature page and how to contact us if you need help.
To wrap up our discussion of the AFQ, here are a few items to remember when preparing and completing the AFQ this year. The AFQ is cash-based, so do not report debt, encumbrances, or capital outlay. Because the survey is cash-based, it will probably not reconcile with your audited financial statements. Although we have not addressed this yet in this session, it is important to remember that revenues should be reported with the entity that first receives those revenues. For example, if revenues are transferred from a hospital to the practice plan, the practice plan may consider these their revenues, but to avoid double counting in the AFQ, these dollars would be reported as hospital support. Also remember that unrestricted fund categories drive the bottom line. Unrestricted funds appear on the data entry tab under headings with a blue background. Just to be clear, when we say the bottom line, we are referring to the very last line of the Revenues Expenditures worksheet, where you see the net revenues over expenditures. As you may recall, earlier in this demo, we talked about how restricted revenues are only reported to the extent that they were spent during the fiscal year. This means restricted revenues appear as a wash in the bottom line. This explains how unrestricted revenues and expenditures drive the values in the bottom line. Because the AFQ is a survey of cash in and cash out during the fiscal year, it is highly unlikely that your total reported revenues will equal total reported expenditures. We do not expect to see that. In some years, you may bring in more cash than you spend, and in other years, you may spend more cash than you bring in. That is expected. Just to reiterate one more time, restricted revenues equal expenditures, and so are a wash, while unrestricted dollars drive the bottom line. Line 72, central support costs borne by the parent. Remember that if you have a parent, broadly defined to mean any administrative structure above the level of your dean, report your share of central support costs on line 72 of the AFQ that are borne by your parent. This amount should come from your parent's controller or budget office, as these costs are not on the books of the medical school. If your parent, controller, or budget office do not have your medical school's exact pro rata share of central support costs, then please ask them to provide you with the best estimate of your medical school's portion. Valid data entries. Keep in mind, only positive numbers can be entered on the data entry sheet. Before you submit your AFQ, check for red-filled data entry cells and data alert messages shown in the margin of the Revenues Expenditures worksheet. Where applicable, please enter an explanation in the respective text box to resolve a data entry alert. The overview survey. We've spent a lot of time talking about the AFQ Excel workbook portion of the LCME Part 1A. Now we will talk about the web-based overview survey. The overview is a companion survey to the AFQ workbook. The overview gives context to the numbers you report in the AFQ. As opposed to the AFQ, it is a web-based survey that you will complete in your browser. The link to your medical school's overview survey is at the bottom of the LCME 1A tab on MSPS. When you click on that link, you will get to a page that looks like this. Here is the view of the welcome screen of the overview survey. Like last year, there are 39 questions in this survey. Be sure to review the data release policy concerning data collected in the overview. In this survey, most items are classified as unrestricted. Let's go to the first page of the survey. The navigation button here allows you to quickly jump from one page to the other in the overview. You can also see a high-level view of the topics the overview survey covers. As you begin working on the AFQ, we encourage you to glance at the overview survey. Familiarize yourself with the questions that are asked so that you and your teams have enough time to collect the data. Remember, you can find a blank PDF version of the overview survey in the LCME 1A tab of the Medical School Profile System, or MSPS. We also have 2 additional questions at the survey feedback section at the end of the overview survey. These questions are classified as confidential. They give you an opportunity to tell us your thoughts about the AFQ and overview survey. You can share anything in this space, such as suggestions on how to improve the survey. We welcome all types of feedback. Our goal is to help make completing the AFQ and overview as straightforward as possible. Finally, I would like to leave you with a few tips for completing the AFQ on time. Start as soon as you are able. We encourage you to make every effort to get the survey in by the mid-December deadline. But if you need a little time, let us know as soon as possible. Do not underestimate how long the AFQ will take, especially if this is your first year working on the survey. Remember, you may have to gather data from many different places at your medical school and from several affiliated institutions. To do this, you may have to establish or reestablish relationships at your medical school and at your affiliated institutions to request the data you need. It may also take your colleagues a few weeks to get the information back to you, so start early and give them ample time to prepare this data for you. Remember that since the AFQ is not an audited financial statement, everything does not have to reconcile to the penny, so do not sweat the small stuff. Don't forget to submit all components of the AFQ, that is 3 items, the AFQ workbook, the overview survey, and the signed signature sheet. And finally, do not be afraid to ask us for help. Send us an email and we will respond as soon as we can. We are happy to set up a call to talk through more complicated issues as well. This concludes the AFQ and overview demonstration session. Thank you for taking time to review these surveys with us. Best wishes for a quick and smooth completion of this year's AFQ and overview survey.